First, I'd like to actually thank you guys for bringing this debate to campus because I think there's a sore lack of healthy debate, even if it gets contentious sometimes. So I'd love a round of applause for these gentlemen.
Sure, yeah.
But jumping straight into the heat of the issue.
Good.
And, just for the sake of being succinct and quick and clear, I think it'd be best to pursue a theme that people have already talked about today, namely sexism in the Bible. And I find that pinning it all in the Old Testament is inaccurate. And I'd like to read you some Bible verses from the New Testament if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
But before I do so, what do you think of books like Corinthians, Ephesians? Would you say that the church should be arranged along the standards that are laid out clearly within the New Testament?
I'm saying that when you get to those issues, those are hard issues of hermeneutics, of interpretation. I can promise you, when Paul writes to a certain young pastor in the city of Ephesus named Timothy that women should not speak, but then he has women partners in ministry who do speak, like Priscilla. When he talks about leadership in a church, into a cultural context where you have a goddess, Diana of the Ephesians, being worshipped. So he's speaking into an incredibly chaotic sexual city. You've got to read in context and not just take 1 Timothy 2 and rip it out of context or 1 Corinthians 11 or 12.
I think that you're kind of misrepresenting specifically what those say. They don't mention the goddess Diana, and they mention some very specific rules that only women are supposed to follow. And I think you see that these rules are the reason that the Catholic Church has been historically sexist with absolutely no women in positions of power, because they are very clearly laid out in Corinthians. So this is 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 10. It is well for a man not to touch a woman. That's 7. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of every woman is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled dishonors her head. For if a woman will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. Man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. To me, it lays out a clear submission of women to men, to the point that if a woman, think nuns for instance, take a point of praying without their head covered, which is why nuns wear the habit, they're to have their heads shaved. That says nothing about Diana. That's very clear rules of how the church is to operate in placing women in a position of submission.
Baloney. Or hogwash. Pick whichever one you want. Why? Because in Acts you do read about Diana of the Ephesians. So you got to go do your homework. You got to read the book of Acts, which includes Paul going into Ephesus. And what he has to deal with is goddess worship. Diana of the Ephesians. So just because he doesn't mention it in 1 Timothy, he's writing to a young man, Timothy, and where is Timothy? He is in Ephesus. So you find out about the goddess worship of Diana of the Ephesians by reading the book of Acts. It's that simple. Second point, read in the Corinthians passage, the context. It is worship that's gone crazy. Women are abusing this new freedom that they have in Christ. And his whole context is he's talking about orderly worship. And so he's addressing women who are getting out of control and are violating some of the cultural norms. Real simple, guys. Now, this doesn't take PhD. In that culture, short hair on a woman implied prostitution. Real simple. Paul is saying, ladies, don't dress like a prostitute. Don't cut your hair like a prostitute. He is not saying women are inferior. Why? Because he hires a husband-wife team, Aquila and Priscilla, to teach the great preacher, Apollos, how to preach. That is a position of incredible teaching and authority on the part of a woman named Priscilla. Third and final point, sir, is Paul was attacking and consistently attacked pantheism, the worship of Mother Earth. And that is why in 1 Timothy, he's getting into who was created first. Pantheism teaches we come from woman, Mother Earth. And Paul is saying, no, Remember back in creation in Genesis? It's Adam who's created first and Eve. It has nothing to do with the value of a man or the value of a woman. It has to do with who came first. It wasn't Mother Earth. And he's going after the pantheism, the goddess worship in Ephesus.
Well, then why didn't the Bible say that? See, the Bible clearly just states that if women pray without their head covered, they are to have their heads shaved.
You bet.
Can I find any women in the audience that think that if women pray without a habit over their head, they should have their head shaved? I think God would have been, in his infinite wisdom, intelligent enough to explain that context, because this book is meant to live on.
Good.
But I would argue that instead,
Yeah.
it is just the barbaric writings of the time
Good.
in which women were oppressed.
Beautiful. And I would argue that you have just put on beautiful display your ethnocentrism. You are not allowing a culture in Corinth and a culture in Ephesus to be different. And therefore, you have no ability to appreciate what the Apostle Paul has to do in stepping into a different culture from your culture. And that's what you better start opening your mind to. That there are different cultures, like the one in Ephesus, the one in Corinth, the one in Austin, Texas. And for you to demand that in the Bible, God says, oh, by the way, because you guys are really super guys, I'm going to explain in Timothy and in Corinthians exactly what I mean. I'm sorry, it's not going to be that way. Instead, he's giving you a good mind.
I will tell you, it contradicts the foundation of your principles
No,
of
it does
why
not.
the Ephesians and Corinthians were even needed. Because your argument is that there was an unsound culture where women were too free to worship their goddess. And so they needed specific rules of how they could and could not pray. So it seems like the rules of Corinthian are the ones that are ethnocentric against women freely worshiping a goddess. It seems like those rules were culturally insensitive and put into place so that women could not be in a position of power within their own religion.
Paul put them in a position of power when he had Priscilla teach Apollos. Paul put women in position of power to teach men. Priscilla taught Apollos. Stuart?
So we're going to keep going to Paul, right? Is he the center of the Christian faith, or is Christ?
No, I think that
Okay, so we'll go to Jesus Christ, probably. He's probably the center of the faith. How did Jesus treat women?
I'm not sure. I didn't exist back then.
Okay, you better check out how Jesus, just read the Bible. How did Jesus treat women? You haven't even checked it out yourself. You went onto Google and you checked out, where's the Bible sexist? Let's pull up
I've read the Bible.
Corinthians and let's pull up Ephesians. You just said you haven't read it. You didn't
No, I
look back
said I
there.
read the Bible
So here's
last night.
how Jesus treated women. He transcended cultural barriers nonstop. John chapter 4 with the woman at the well. That was breaking the law to reach out to her and to love her. The healing of the woman in the streets with the internal bleeding. Illegal. He's healing her. Constantly reaching out to women. Again, the resurrection. Who is used in the resurrection accounts? Who are the first ones to see the risen Christ? Women. Constantly elevating women in Scripture throughout Jesus' entire life. Secondly, you want to talk about your ethnocentric tendencies? Talk to my Eastern friends who come over to me and say, hey, Stuart, guess what? Actually, the Christian understanding today, the Christian understanding of women's rights, gender equality is way more liberating than our Eastern understanding. So if you want to talk about ethnocentric, why aren't you talking to them? Are you atheist or what are
I'm
you?
agnostic.
Okay, from an agnostic, I don't know if you're humanistic, naturalist, materialist, but from that perspective, you go talk to them and explain to them, this is why women, from my point of view, whether it's agnostic, materialistic, naturalistic, from my point of view, this is how we should treat women. And you cannot back that up from your agnostic, naturalistic.
You can.
You go ahead and tell me.
and you're
Go
assuming
ahead.
things. But
So
I
that's
also
how Christ
hold on,
handles
Let
women,
me address.
That's how Christ handled
Please
women.
don't talk over me if you want me to address.
No, we'll let you talk, but you better listen, and you better get the point. He gave a beautiful outline of how Jesus treated women.
Right. But
All right.
in his
You got
biography,
the floor. Talk.
You're right. I never said that Christianity, the book of the Bible, was filled with contradictions or that it was a purely evil document. I think that the Bible is simply as flawed as the men who wrote it within the context of the time. Of course, they're going to paint their Messiah to be this perfect moral being, but I don't think it justifies the specific instructions laid out for the church in Corinthian. Would you disavow the Catholic Church's historical record of taking those to be literal and forcing nuns to wear habits and only allowing male
Great question.
priests? But you don't contradict Paul when he thought that the women practicing their own religion needed to be kicked into line and have hats put on their head. And
I can promise you, if you think the guy who wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter, kicked women into line, you could not be more false.
I mean, it's written very clearly. So at this point, I think we have a pure breakdown of dialogue because you're almost like acting like those things don't exist and that somehow that there's this built-in context which isn't stated in the Bible. The Bible just states instructions for the church. So at this point, I would urge the audience, I'm going to step away so the next people.
You bet.
But I would urge the audience to read the Bible
Bravo.
and to understand
That's exactly right.
that the Bible doesn't build in contexts and that the Catholic Church, when it mistreated women over the years, we're being good Christians because they took the instructions of the church laid out in the Bible literally, which is all you can do from a
You are reacting to your narrow-minded Christian background. That's all you're doing. You're not reading the text honestly. I understand why you're turned off by your narrow-minded Christian background. But you gotta grow up, guys. And you can't let the Catholic Church or the Baptist Church or whatever Christian fundamentalists you talk to turn you off. You gotta read the text for yourself. That's where we do agree.
Well, I would urge you to not selectively read it and only focus on 3 chapters out of an entire book, because all you speak of is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
That's not
and
3 chapters. Those are 4 books.
You always pivot.
No, I don't pivot.
You always
I
pivot
answer you head to head, and I know it disturbs you because you haven't had this kind of talk before.
I actually
but
love
that's
this.
okay.
This is why I came back. If it disturbed me, I would have run away with my tail between my legs. Stop with the ad hominem attacks. It takes
You
away
are
from the
disturbed
quality
by the content of the answers.
No, I'm disturbed.
Because the judgments you make are inaccurate.
With the misrepresentation. So the Communist Manifesto lays out that you are to have no private property. If a communist came to me and told me that that's not true and communists are for private property, and then I cite within his document where it specifically says you are not to have private property, to me that is exactly what you're doing. You're doing an absurd, like, oh, well, that's context. It doesn't count. He didn't really mean women are...
I never said it doesn't count.
No, you did. Because
no, I did not. I said you had better read everything in context. Everything. That's one of the principles of sound interpretation. You read in context. So when Jesus says in Luke 14, I tell you the truth, unless you hate your mom and dad, your wife and children, you cannot be my disciple. You don't jerk that out of context and say, oh, guys, Jesus is calling you to hate mom and dad and hate wife and children. No, you read it in context, which is you are to love your mom and dad, you're to love everybody, but your love for God is to make your love for your family pale into hatred when they are compared. And when Jesus says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. You better read in context and not take a knife out and gouge your eye out. You better allow a speaker to use hyperbole, metaphor, extreme form of speech to make a point. That's how you interpret fairly.
All right. Well, I would say thank you for this debate.
You bet. Good to meet you.